Welcome to Manhwa Recaps. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. We learned that a century ago, the sky fell apart, and dungeons appeared. Monsters flooded out of the dungeons and normal weapons couldn't harm them. And only those who awakened could fight them. And thanks to the Awakener's performance, the world stabilized. And this let a new civilization take root. And some Awakeners became hunters to take down monsters. But after a few decades, there were too many hunters, and once it became revealed that anyone could awaken if they had money, this meant the number of people who wanted to become hunters increased. And this led to the Great Age of Hunters. This was when the government made the Pro-Hunter exam. And limited only those that passed the test to become hunters. And naturally, the institutions that taught everything one needed to know to become a hunter, were called hunter academies. We see a dragon holding its severed arm, asking how such a human can exist. And the human replies that maybe the dragon is just a frog in a well. And the man explains that in order to become a hunter, people have to attend the hunter academy. We see the dragon unleash a breath attack, and the human describes the academy he will attend. And we see multiple prominent figures from different cultures. And that it's on a completely different dimension than other academies. We see him walking away from the dragon's corpse, and he starts a lecture. The Manhwa starts by introducing us to our main character, Kim Seo-jun. He explains he's a natural awakener, which means he was born with more strength than others. But due to his deceased parents' death, he is a porter for dead monsters. And the only reason he is able to endure the work is because of his dream to become a pro-hunter. We see him talking to some co-workers, and they ask how saving up to become a hunter. Seo-jun replies that he's been searching for a cheap hunter academy. It is also explained that due to hunter academies being taught by people with experience, this created a gap between the educated and uneducated. And that he has finally saved up enough for 1 year of classes. And that he'd love to go to a more popular academy, but they are expensive. He receives an ad on his phone for Transcension Academy. The ad describes how the professors are tens of thousands of years old, and offer custom tasks for individual students. And shows some reviews from students, but Seo-jun thinks the ad is crazy. He looks at some of the professors' names and sees Hercules, and Heaven's Great Sage, and he decides to check out the Great Sage. A red monkey appears on his screen and introduces himself, and his weapon. The Great Sage says it's hard to understand from just an explanation, so he demonstrates. The first movement he covers is to deflect outwards. Disperse is the name. And the second he demonstrates is pierce. And we see him blow a mountain away. This amazes Seo-jun and he receives a notification that says, if you take this lecture, you will obtain the Great Sage DGP. Seo-jun makes an account, and the registration fee is all of the money he has saved up. Seo-jun decides they are scammers, and decides to try Arc Academy instead. We see a crane lifting a hybrid goat monster. The crane's chain snaps, and Seo-jun describes how life is a comedy from far away, but up close, it's a tragedy. And the monster falls on him. We learn that the nerves in his leg are undergoing necrosis, and now he has refused work, and the surgery is his entire savings. Now all Seo-jun has left is 3,000 to his name, and he wonders if he can do it all again. He gets a notification on his phone and it says, the past of a transcended is always low, and there's a special sale on new students. The registration fee is adjusted to 3,000 and he wonders if it's asking for all he is because it has changed since last time. He decides to try registering, because he has no money in his account. We see the 3,000 beside his hospital bed disappears. Another notification says, congratulations on becoming a member. A small pink-haired person pops out of his phone and introduces himself as his mentor. Seo-jun asks him if his name is Mentor, and he says no. I am your mentor, my name is Mentor. Mentor mentions how Odysseus was his first student, and the goal of the academy is to teach those who want to transcend the limits of their race. Seo-jun asks if it's for transcended and not hunters, and Mentor tells him you can't even compare the two. And makes him fill out an aptitude test. His first question asks what field he wants, and he selects combat. The second asks about his skill level, and Mentor asks him questions and he says no to every one of them. This shocks Mentor and he wonders how he was able to register at the academy even though he's so weak. But it's fine because they'll never kick out a member, and finish the questions. Seo-jun answers them all, and he helps him pick a free class because of his free pass. He decides to take Buddha's lessons so he can learn unwavering heart, which can allow him to break through most transcension fields. Seo-jun decides to watch the lecture, and it shows Buddha asking questions, and Seo-jun quickly notices that the lecture is really hard. He feels like he's going to lose his mind. After all of that, he's only 0.06% done with the lecture. 1 week later, we see Seo-jun fully healed, and even the doctor is surprised. We learn that, thanks to Buddha's lecture, it helps speed up his recovery. Now he's at 1.3%, and he's excited for 100. He finally learns this is the real deal, and he contemplates Krion's lecture, to learn the metamorphosis skill. He starts the lecture, and we see Chiron introduce himself. He also happens to be the teacher of almost every hero in Greek mythology. Chiron mentions how he won't teach combat in this course, and he begins to say the first step to becoming transcended is, then, clears his throat and yells at him to get up and move. Which startles Seo-jun. We see Seo-jun on the floor, and he is assigned a daily task. It is physical training, and he decides to listen to his doctor's orders, so he closes the training pop-up. But it spams his phone, and he decides to listen to more of Buddha's lecture. He sees there's an expiration date on his free pass, and he instantly begins doing his daily task. He decides to absorb all of the content in the lectures, and begins exercising for the first time in a while. Because of his physical job, he didn't bother with exercise. He finishes 300 push-ups, but realizes the counter only counted 81 of them. He realizes without proper form, it doesn't count the number. He finally finishes the task after the entire day, and 3 days later, as he's going to exercise again, he sees on TV a monster has appeared in Seoul. An old lady asks Seo-jun if he'll be on TV one day too, and an old man chimes in, saying it's difficult to become a pro. And that Seo-jun isn't even a cadet yet, and should give up. Seo-jun thinks about all the work he's been through, and this angers him. And tells the man he'll decide what to do with his own life, and that he should worry about himself first. The man yells at Seo-jun, but he ignores him and walks away. Seo-jun thinks about what he says and calls it bullshit, saying that it's not impossible to be a pro with the Transcension Academy. And that he will become a hunter. It cuts to a woman saying she hates being a hunter. While fighting some monsters, she wonders what's the point of making an academy, that everything costs money and she has no cadets. And that she's going to be annoyed. We see one of the monsters is still alive. We see Seo-jun laying in his bed, glad that he's home from the hospital. He mentions how there's a year left until the exam, but he has nothing in his bank account now. He registers for another lecture, and we see Chiron talking about how the first step for a transcend is sense. And that he's 5.7% into the lecture. We see Seo-jun's boss being snooty towards him, and Seo-jun mentions how he wouldn't be there if he had a choice. But he doesn't have enough money to feed himself. Seo-jun continues to listen to Chiron's lecture on senses, and Kriun says he'll teach a method that will unlock the sixth sense, intuition. We see one of Seo-jun's co-workers try to jokingly hit him, but Seo-jun dodges. This surprises the both of them, and he jokingly asks if he has eyes on the back of his head. We see Seo-jun gets to work carrying monster parts, and he wonders why he feels so strong today. So he decides to do some of his daily tasks at work. He realizes that squatting with the excess weight adds multiple rep numbers to the task. Seo-jun thinks this is fire, and decides to do his task while working. The more weight there is, the more the count increases. So he can earn money, and save time at the same time. He's finally back home, and is glad that he can be efficient in doing his tasks while working, but that it's hard. He finished his tasks, and his lectures for the day. He decides to listen to another free lecture, and it's from Xiangyu. He begins the lecture, and Xiangyu says that Trash wants to learn the spear, but that he'll teach them. And he gives him a new daily task, of swinging a spear weapon 5,000 times. The next day at work, we see the woman complaining about having no students at Seo-jun's work. And we learn that she's the granddaughter of the Sword Star, and her name is Park So-yoon. We learn the Sword Star is a man named Park Min-chul, and 100 years ago, he was one of the Awakeners who helped return civilization to the world. In other words, a hero. And sure, he may be an old man now, but he's still a heavyweight in terms of power. He decides it's none of his business and continues his exercise. So-yoon asks his boss what he's doing, and she wonders if something is wrong with his head. One of his co-workers asks how long he's going to continue doing that for, and the two joke about it. Behind his co-worker, we can see a giant beast getting up off the floor, and beginning to attack his co-worker. Seo-jun screams out to him. We see Park So-yoon is glad that she's gotten away from Seo-jun's boss. She overhears some people talking about her, and they wonder why her level is so low. And we learn to her the name of the Sword Star is just a burden to her. Because she was unable to overcome the wall that was her grandfather, and that her real dream is to be a teacher, but because of her grandpa, she was unable to live the life she wanted. So she made her own academy, but once people found out it wasn't her grandpa teaching, everyone left. Because they didn't enroll for her, but her grandpa, she wishes she just had one cadet. One of Seo-jun's co-workers tells her to run because of a monster, and it shows the man below the monster telling Seo-jun to run, but he realizes if he runs, the man will die. And that it's too late for anyone else to save him, but who will save the man? Seo-jun grabs a pipe and runs toward the monster, and swings at it, but the monster dodges. He tells the man to run, and Seo-jun decides to stall for time until the other hunters show up. Seo-jun tries to tell himself not to be scared, and he remembers Buddha's teachings and he calms down. The monster jumps at him, and he realizes it'll be too late if he has to think about his reactions. So he puts his faith in Chiron's teachings of intuition and dodges the monster. He jumps above and wonders if he should attack or not. He remembers Shen Yu's teachings and decides to split the monster. He uses the power to pull out mountains, and hits the monster. We see Seo-yun running over, asking about what happened, and she sees Seo-jun over the corpse of the monster. Seo-jun is surprised that it actually worked. Seo-yun stares at Seo-jun and says she's found him. A proper cadet. As Seo-jun leaves work, he sees his progress increased a lot, and wonders if it's because of the manticore he killed. We see Seo-yun approach him, and she asks if he has the time to talk. He tells her yes, and she asks him if he wants to meet her grandpa. He tells her no, and this confuses her. She tells him to wait. And he asks if she wants him to join, and he tells her no. And she begrudgingly asks what about if her grandpa teaches him. And he tells her it does not matter. She asks him more questions, about how he'll do on the written test, or joining raids. And she tells him that she won't ask for any payment. And he asks if she wants to be affiliated, and mentions how if there are perks, there must be a duty he has to perform. She tells him before she passes the pro exam to attend some competitions under her academy name, and when people ask to say he attends there. He realizes it's a tempting offer, but doesn't know why she's so desperate. He asks her why she's willing to go so far, and she tells him that she sees his potential. He likes her answer, and they introduce themselves to each other. The next day she hands him his temporary license, and he's excited because this is just the beginning. He asks her to teach him the method for raiding. She tells him to pick a weapon, and tells him she already has a raid appointment for him. We see inside the dungeon, he is fighting some kobolds, and he asks why she followed him. She tells him to just think of her as a safety device. As he's walking in the dungeon, his intuition goes off and he dodges a surprise attack, and quickly hits the monster back. He sees the progress for his lectures is increasing, and compares it to a grinding experience in a game, and charges straight into some kobolds. We see Seo-yun calling Seo-jun weird, and that he's been staring at a blank screen the entire time. But it's even weirder that a cadet, without training, can kill kobolds like a veteran. And then exercises with their corpses. We see Seo-jun is happy that he has money in his bank account again. And he wonders if he'll ever be as strong as Sun Wukong, then remembers that he saw one of his free lectures, and that he didn't attend it because he didn't have money. He registers for the class, but he sees the fee is 27 million. Realizing he can't take the lecture, he wonders if the academy sells any items, and he sees mythic level equipment. He buys the training copy of a spear, but the next day we see him training harder than last time. And it turns out the spear cost 100k. Seo-yun explains to him about a competition between academies, and based on your performance, you get to participate in a higher league. She tells Seo-jun she wants him to participate as her representative, and he agrees since it's part of their agreement. He realizes he has no experience fighting humans, and asks her to spar with him. They begin sparring, and she realizes his movements are awkward, and sloppy. She realizes she overestimated him, and attempts to end it with her next strike, but he blocks it. She is confused because it was infused with mana, and his weapon was meant to fly out of his hands. Seo-jun tells her he'll also go all out. She realizes his attacks have become much faster and sharper. And how much of a difference it is. We see him following some of Chiron's teachings while sparring with her. She begins to fall down, and he uses this opportunity to attack her. Realizing she's in danger, she uses mana, and Seo-jun says it looks like he ended up losing. She's surprised that he thought he could actually win. We see that Seo-jun's lecture progress increased. And he asks her if they can spar more often before the tournament. Because the spars will help him a lot. She agrees, and says she'll listen to what he asks. And that she will give him the prize money if he wins the tournament, and that the prize is 100k. And he thinks of the training spear. He asks how long until the tournament, and she tells him 2 weeks, and he is immediately fired up. He begins to exercise on the spot. It cuts 2 weeks ahead into the tournament and we see a man with glasses, who is nervous and afraid because of all the competition, sees Seo-jun with his shabby equipment, and thinks of him as a comrade. And that he came alone. He introduces himself as Lee Mingi. Mingi begins to explain random things to Seo-jun, and he wonders if he's one of those explanation characters. Another cadet named Lee Junwan tells everyone they should be quiet, and Mingi explains how there's a rumor that Seo-yun made an offer to him to be her cadet. But he had declined the offer. But Seo-jun understands why he probably did. But we see Junwan regrets not taking her offer, because even if he wins nobody will recognize him for it. But we learn he was just going to use her, and discard her after. He notices Seo-jun and wonders why a peasant like him is participating. We see the first match start, and it's called the Dungeon Maze Race. We see some reporters watching the tournament, and one of them bumps into Seo-yun. They see Junwan instantly kills a monster, and they are surprised that he's a cadet. Seo-yun recognizes his name, and wonders why he is there, and how Seo-jun is doing. Seo-jun continues through the maze and ends up at a 3-way, and an unknown feeling tries to lead him down one of the other paths. And he wonders if it's Chiron's teachings. He decides to trust it, and he thinks it's weird. He's been walking for a while, but keeps hearing notifications of people being eliminated, but nothing is happening around him. And he wonders if his intuition is avoiding monsters too. He runs into Miji in the maze, and Miji asks him if he knows where he's going, and he tells him he's just walking by following his gut. Miji says that's bad, and that he'll lead the way from now on. Miji says he'll use a method to traverse the maze, and Seo-jun tells him that it would take too long, and that he'll just trust his gut. And wonders why Miji is following him, and Miji says he thought the weak should stay together. Miji explains that his parents are gone, and all he has left is his little sister, and Seo-jun relates to him. And says they are comrades in a similar situation. But the money from the prize is all his. Miji follows him, and mentions how it's like he knows where he's going. They come to a dead end, and Seo-jun puts his hand on the wall and opens a door. We see that he is the first to finish the maze, and everyone is shocked to see it is Seo-jun, and not Junwan. We see the shocked people mention how fast first place was, but that he's from a no-name academy. In the waiting room, we see Junwan approach Seo-jun, and he calls him a lucky guy and walks away. We also learn that the second part of the tournament will be one-on-ones. And Seo-jun realizes there should be 32 rounds, and wonders how it will go. He sees a man forfeit. And it cuts to Seo-yun, who overhears some people yelling about how the match is already starting from the semi-finals. It turns out that almost everyone forfeited, and we learn the people yelling are gamblers. One of the men says that Junwan is going to win, but we see a mysterious person bet 1 million on Seo-jun to win, which shocks Seo-yun. We see the first round is Seo-jun against a man named Jang Dukshul. And the second round is Junwan versus Mingi, and another contestant gets a freebie. We see Seo-jun and Dukshul on stage, and Dukshul says that his luck will end here, and that he's unlucky to have met him here. Seo-jun tells him we don't know which of them is unlucky yet, which angers Dukshul. The match starts, and Dukshul charges at him. It cuts to the waiting area and we see Mingi is losing hope, wondering if he should just forfeit. But hears on the TV that the match was decided in the blink of an eye. And we learn that Seo-jun has already won. It shows some of the fight between Seo-jun and Dukshul, and we see Seo-jun easily avoiding Dukshul's attacks. And this angers Dukshul that he's doing it so effortlessly, and he puts his mana into an attack. But we see Seo-jun knocks his weapon out of his hands, and Dukshul falls to the floor. Miji and Junwan's fight begins. And Junwan says he can tell without fighting Miji, that he's just a prey, and will be eaten by a predator like himself. We see Junwan charges at Miji and unleashes a relentless attack, but Miji is able to block them. This angers Junwan and he hits Miji with the handle of his sword. We see this hurts Miji, and causes him to fall to his knee. As he's wondering if he's going to lose, he remembers Seo-jun's fight and stands back up. and sets it his goal to just hit Junwon once, and charges at him. We see that Junwon knocked away his attack, and Miji is laying on the floor. We see Junwon has a cut on his face and is bleeding, and this angers him greatly. Junwon tells the ref he's going to forfeit, and he knees Miji in the face. He walks over to the unconscious Miji and puts his foot on his head, saying he should know his place. We see Seo-jun clashes with Junwon, and Seo-jun tells him he was going to wait until the finals, but he deserves to be beaten now. He tells Junwon to move his foot. Junwon pushes more down on Miji's head, and asks what if he doesn't? Seo-jun swings at his foot, knocking his shoe off. Seo-jun asks why he's treating Miji like this, and he says that only the capable can succeed, and to survive, you have to squash others. Seo-jun tells the ref to take care of Miji and tells Junwon that's not something he can evaluate. Seo-jun charges at Junwon, and attacks him, but the attack is blocked. Junwon sends him flying backward, and charges in at Seo-jun. Seo-jun manages to block his attacks, but realizes that he's strong. But he clears his mind and lands a hit on Junwon. Junwon says he's a predator, but sees the eyes of a predator in Seo-jun's eyes too. He attacks Seo-jun from above, and we see that he's getting confused as Seo-jun continues to block all of his attacks. And that it's like watching a monster grow in front of him. They trade hits, and knock each other back, and this angers Junwon, and he infuses mana into his blade. Seo-jun wonders what to do, and if he should run away, but remembers a lecture from Xiangyu, and activates his power to uproot mountains, and infuses mana into his spear. They begin to collide in the middle of the arena, and we see their auras crashing against each other. This causes a giant dust cloud around the two of them, but once it fades, we see Junwon falls to the floor, while Seo-jun remains standing. The people cheer as Seo-jun stands over Junwon. We see the crowd cheering for him, and Seo-jun is shocked by him infusing mana into his spear. We see the person who bet 1 million is screaming that isn't possible, and disappears. We see Seo-jun tired, walking away from the tournament, and we learn that he was disqualified. And that the man who got the freebie, Chulmin, ended up winning without having to fight. But from his fight, his lecture progress went up a lot. Seo-jun approaches him and asks how he is. He apologizes to her because he could have won, and she asks if he's okay because he didn't get the prize money. He says he regrets not winning, but he would have regretted it more if he had not stepped into their fight. We see Mingi approach him and asks if he'll be like him if he trains more, and Seo-jun tells him it'll be difficult, but that he shouldn't let anyone tell him he can't do what he wants. And that even if others say he has no talent, he doesn't need to let their opinions become his reality. And that if he wishes for something, he just needs to do it. We see Miji crying, and he says he'll visit him again. We see Seo-jun and Seo-jun talking, and he says he should have recommended Mingi to join their academy. And she's happy to hear him refer to it as theirs. She tells him she'll buy a weapon for him, and they continue walking. It cuts to the Sword Saint's aide telling the Sword Saint that his granddaughter attended the most recent tournament. And that it seems as if she recruited a new student. And the Sword Saint says he'll see what kind of guy he is. It cuts to Seo-jun training, and Seo-jun asks him what mana cultivation technique he uses. This confuses Seo-jun, and she explains how he needs a technique to handle mana. Seo-jun thinks to himself he hasn't learned one, but she thinks that he doesn't want to answer, and decides it can't be helped. She tells him she has some business to attend to and leaves. And he makes a joke about he's surprised that she has something to do. We see her flushed face leaving the building. We see Seo-jun receiving a lecture on mana from Merlin. He receives a new daily task to gather mana orbs. He decides to give it a try, and he realizes Kreon's teachings have helped him feel and control mana. But it's hard to shape it. He remembers more of Merlin's teachings, and manages to manifest mana. But realizes it's tiny, and it probably won't count toward the daily task. We see the Sword Saint yells at him, and that he came to check on Seo-jun's student, but recognizes that him controlling mana means he has a lot of talent. And he thinks the only reason a talented man would join Seo-jun's academy, is to use his granddaughter. The Sword Saint asks who he is, and Seo-jun introduces himself. And says that Seo-jun just left for some business. The Sword Saint asks why he's unfazed, and explains he let out killing intent that only an S rank could handle. And then asks him to tell him his objective. And says that someone with his talent could go anywhere, and why he has gotten close to Seo-jun. And that he better tell the truth. Seo-jun tries to tell him it's a misunderstanding, and the Sword Saint tells him he knew he wouldn't talk easily, and swipes at his face. Jun barely dodges and loses some of his hair. We see that Yun actually went to her grandpa's and that she wanted to talk to him about Jun. It cuts back to the Sword Saint telling Jun to speak, and what his objective is. We see the Sword Saint said tell Yun that her grandpa went to her academy, and she runs off. And she decides she can't let the two of them meet. It cuts back to Jun realizing the Sword Saint hasn't even unsheathed his sword. And that he is trying to restrain him, and not kill him. The Sword Saint asks who he is, and Jun tries to tell him again it's a misunderstanding. The Sword Saint tells him that he not only formed mana, but showed such movement and still claims it as a misunderstanding. He then strikes at Jun again, but is blocked. He tells him he doesn't know what Yun has said, but to calm down. For some reason, this angers the Sword Saint more, and realizing that he isn't going to listen. Jun prepares to fight him. But he realizes that if the Sword Saint wanted him dead, he would be dead. As he's the Sword Saint for a reason. Jun realizes this is a great opportunity, and, the Sword Saint realizes his aura has changed. And says he's met countless hunters, but there's only one person who showed determination against him. And that he must be greatly skilled, and wonders again why he approached Yun. We see the Sword Saint has an intimidating presence, and Jun realizes that this will be an attack he won't be able. But he wants to know how long he can last, and he begins parrying the attacks, and charges at the Sword Saint. The Sword Saint hits him in the side, and the Sword Saint tells him he only has to answer his question. Jun realizes tricks won't work, and that he only gets one shot. And he has to end it in one shot. He dodges the Sword Saint's attack, and we see as he's dodging, he remembers Merlin's teachings about mana, and strikes at the Sword Saint with all that he's got. We see him hit something, but he falls to the floor. We see that he's cut the suit of the Sword Saint, and he yells at him for finally showing his true colors. Jun says he's the one who attacked him first, and wonders when Yun will get there. This causes the Sword Saint to snap, and he tells him if he wishes for it so much, he will send him to death. But we see Yun tells him to stop, and asks what he's doing, and calls out to her grandpa with a flustered face. We see Yun asking if Jun is okay, and he tells her it hurts. And the Sword Saint makes a joke about him being a man. And Jun makes one back, then hides behind Yun. Yun tells her grandpa to stop it, and apologizes to Jun. He understands the atmosphere and decides to leave. We see her talking to her grandpa, and he tells her that Jun is suspicious. And she tells him he's not suspicious, and we learn her grandpa would trouble any student that she's gotten previously. He tells her to wrap it up, and she repeatedly yells at him that she doesn't want to. Because she has a feeling when she's with him, that makes her want to be with him longer. And while she may be unable to answer why, she wants to find out what that feeling is. She tells him she doesn't want to live under his shadow, and sees her grandpa's shocked face. She apologizes for raising her voice, and tells him she isn't going to do as she wants. And he wonders if she's ever had such a strong opinion about something before. And we learn that he was all that Yun had left after his son died. And to make sure she could defend herself, he was strict with her. Even if this isn't the path she wanted, and because of the pressure he's been putting on her, an emotional rift has formed between them. And this is the result of that, rebellion. We see that Yun called Jun, and she briefly explained why the Sword Saint attacked him, and he now understands why the Sword Saint was so hostile towards him. Jun thinks to himself as he enters the academy, that it'd be nice if he got an apology from the Sword Saint, and once he's inside, the Sword Saint greets him. And tells him to sit down for a bit, which scares Jun. We see Jun and the Sword Saint talking, and Jun explains why he's at the academy to him. The Sword Saint realizes he's telling the truth, but is still confused about his talent. He asks the Sword Saint if he can leave for training, and the Sword Saint thinks he can understand where his strength comes from if he watches him train. We see the Sword Saint making a funny face, and thinking that Jun is crazy. He asks if Jun is meditating, and he tries to give him some advice. But Jun brushes it off. The Sword Saint is confused because he's ignoring his teachings, and offers to teach him personally. And is taking pride that he responded, but Jun says he's alright. This is an L for the Sword Saint. We see Yun enters and apologizes to Jun, but she sees her grandpa and tells him he wants to bully him again, but is interrupted by the Sword Saint. He tells her that Jun is crazy, and explains that he's ignoring his teachings. And that he's really just nuts. She says it may seem weird at the moment, but that's how she thought at first, 2. The Sword Saint thinks to himself that he doesn't like Seo-jun, but he notices So-yoon is always smiling with him. And how he's never seen her smile like that. One of the Sword Saint's aides tells the Sword Saint that a group called the Order of Truth is asking to meet with him. And that they've also asked for Seo-jun to meet with them too. The Sword Saint asks Seo-jun if he's part of the order, because how else would they him? So-yoon remembers the man who bet on the tournament, and thinks it's him. Seo-jun wonders if he has to go, and they explain to him that the Order of Truth is a prestigious group, and the one asking for him, Sir Kalia, is an important figure. Seo-jun responds by saying that he's still someone he doesn't know, and the Sword Saint's aide tells him that Kalia predicted that he'd deny his request, and offers him 100k for visiting. And Seo-jun wonders how he knew he needed 100k in the first place. We learn more about the Order of Truth, and how they serve truth rather than a god. There are 7 apostles, and their words are the truth. And how they used to be treated like a cult, but they helped during the Great Cataclysm, and how they defeated a monster that nobody else could defeat. We see Seo-jun and the rest outside of a hotel for their meeting with the Order. Seo-jun still wonders why they offered him 100k, and explains it might have been a random number to entice him. They are introduced to a room, and told to wait until Sir Kalia greets them. Seo-jun asks the Sword Saint if he's met Kalia, and he says no, but they've called a couple of times. Seo-jun asks if he's met the Grand Voice before, and the Sword Saint he hasn't, but he's seen him from a distance. They hear a knock at the door, and Kalia walks into the room. Kalia introduces herself. And when Seo-jun goes to introduce himself, she says she knows who he is. He asks how she knows him, and she explains during the tournament, one of her believers watched his match, so she was interested and invited him too. And asks what the true motive for inviting him was. She explains that she wanted the Sword Saint to assist her on a dungeon recon. He asks why he needs to attend, and she tells him the Order of Truth thinks the dungeon is worth checking out. He asks what she'll give him in return, and she mentions how it doesn't seem like he wants anything. But brings up So-yoon's academy. And this makes the Sword Saint release killing intent. He tells her if she mentions his granddaughter again, he won't leave her alone. Kalia apologizes, and says she'll listen to one of the Sword Saint's requests. And she performs the vow of truth. She then tells Seo-jun the Order would like to sponsor him, and that they aren't asking him to leave the academy, and that they will help in the areas the academy can't. He asks what he has to do in return, and she tells him that them just having a relationship is more than enough. Seo-jun thinks they'll want something in return later on, and says he'll think about it if she answers one of his questions. And asks what they see on his smart screen. We see Seo-jun has a Buddha lecture on, but Kalia says it's just a black screen. Seo-jun decides not to take their sponsorship. It cuts to Kalia talking to one of her believers and asks the man Kalkus if he's sure about what he saw. And truthfully, there was nothing special about Seo-jun, but it startled Kalia when Seo-jun asked about the phone screen. And gave them an unpleasant feeling. We see the Sword Saint asks why Seo-jun rejected the proposal, and he says it leaves a bad taste in his mouth. Seo-jun asks the Sword Saint about his conversation with Kalia. And the Sword Saint explains that distortion in a dungeon is when the mana is distorted, and they lead to an increase in a dungeon's rank, or dungeon breaks. And while it's not common now, but during the Cataclysm it was common. The Sword Saint warns Seo-jun and tells him that if he pulls any moves on So-yoon he won't leave him alone. Seo-jun meets back up with So-yoon, and she thanks him, and mentions how he needs money, and he shows him a dungeon sweep contest. We see the prize is 300k for the contest, and we learn the purpose is to stop a dungeon break from occurring. Seo-jun realizes he can raise lecture progress while attending, and decides to join. And realizes she probably searched for the contest for him. She explains how it lasts for a week, and when it starts, he'll receive the list of destinations. And that the dungeon must be cleared within 10 hours of reservation, and they can only reserve one at a time. Seo-jun realizes that he'll have to handle the corpses after the raid, and that speed is crucial. He wonders what the exact rules are, and it cuts to the day of the competition. We see his lecture progress, and we see that some of his lectures are stagnating, so they might require something different. We see that Seo-jun called for the old man Mancho, the man he saved from the Manticore, to help with the monster's corpses. The event starts, and So-yoon tells him fighting. We see Mancho and Seo-jun get into a truck, and explain the 2 elements of winning are 1, how fast you can raid. And 2, how quickly can you reach the dungeon. And he asks Mancho to plan out their travel path, and Mancho tells him to hold on tight. We see outside of a gate that a supervisor named Go Sujin just watched Seo-jun go into the dungeon, and she thinks it's going to take him an hour. And how she was anxious because she thought at first it was cheating, but Mancho sitting outside the dungeon isn't against the rules. She sees the gate begins to warp, and Seo-jun pokes his head out and tells Mancho to get ready. She tells him that having someone interfere is against the rules, and he says he knows, but he's done. She goes in and sees piles of corpses, and asks Seo-jun what he's doing. As he does lunges with a goblin corpse. We see Seo-jun continues bringing monsters to Mancho for him to butcher. And they head to the next dungeon. We see another dungeon supervisor enjoying his peaceful day, and we see Seo-jun pull up and instantly go into the dungeon. He quickly disposes of some skeletons and leaves their bones with Mancho. They quickly finish and leave. The poor supervisor is lost. We see at the dungeon management office he's going over the number of dungeons that have been cleared, and he's shocked that second place is at 16, while Seo-jun is at 32. He asks if it's correct, and they explain how it's legit, and he really raided that many dungeons. And they think someone is helping him, because it's a lot of dungeons. And we see that the girl in second place is going to cheat, and that she hates someone named Jinsu. It cuts and shows Seo-jun and Mancho on a bench, and Seo-jun tells him about how much money they've earned so far. And how they are splitting it 50-50. Mancho is surprised because he says that Seo-jun should have 70% instead. And that if he doesn't agree to this he won't show up to work tomorrow. Seo-jun asks Mancho if he's not surprised by how fast he's clearing dungeons, and he tells him he watched the tournament fight. On the second day of the competition, we see someone approach them asking if they are the dungeon dismantlers, and it seems they've gained a nickname. And at first, he was doubtful, but after watching them there were no issues. We see on the ranking board that Seo-jun is at 73 clears, and in second place Lee Soyeon is at 36. Seo-jun goes to reserve a dungeon, but sees there's none left. Mancho and Seo-jun agree the situation is fishy, and it continued to happen, and they were only able to raid 10 dungeons in a day. Mancho recognizes it as second place's scheme, and Seo-jun recognizes he might lose at this rate. He tells Mancho that until a gap is formed between first and second again that dismantling will need to be stopped. And Seo-jun says he has a plan. It cuts to Lee Soyeon inside of a dungeon, and once she finishes and is ready to go to the next one, she is told all the dungeons near her are reserved already. This shocks her, and she realizes Seo-jun keeps reserving the dungeons near her. On the 5th day, they finally meet, and Seo-jun tells her, regardless of who wins, that they should play fair. Because the competition has good intentions, she laughs and says there is no such thing as good intentions. She enters her dungeon, and quickly returns to see the dismantling squad putting in work. She's confused, and Seo-jun asks if he can have the corpses in her gate. She says sure, and watches him do lunges with the goblins' corpses. She asks why he's doing it, and he says money, of course. It cuts to the sword saint on top of a monster, and asks Kalia why there was a 10-star inside of a 6-star dungeon. She says it's a mistake because of the distortion, and we're introduced to Young Jimin, the magic saint's disciple, who gets the two to stop arguing. Kalia wonders if a similar situation could happen in a different dungeon, and they decide all low-ranked dungeons need to be re-evaluated. And we see some supervisors for the competition are shocked by 3 gates being attached together, which is the first time it's happened. We see that Seo-jun and Mancho are constantly being interrupted while going about their dungeon route, and Seo-yoon decides to send a complaint. It works, but on their way to another dungeon, they are being interrupted still, which causes Seo-jun to lose first place. But, Seo-jun has a plan, and we learn that instead of reserving the dungeon ahead of time, he only reserves it once he's near. And due to how fast he clears, they can't block him. It shows Seo-jun and Soyeon clearing dungeons, and after a few clears, they end up being tied at 141. It cuts to a meeting room for the contest and it shows Seo-yoon and Seon's dad arguing with each other. To get them to stop arguing, one of the men in the meeting room gives them a suggestion. One of the team leaders for the dungeon management explains to Seo-jun and Seon that out of the 3 dungeons ahead of them, whoever raids theirs faster will be able also to finish the last, and will win the competition. Seo-jun asks if he can choose first, and he chooses the blue portal, and Seon picks the red. They both race into their dungeon. Seo-jun runs around him for a bit, but is confused because there aren't any kobolds, but he hears a monster roar, and what approaches him is a manticore. He wonders why a 4-star monster is there, but quickly kills it. Jun quickly runs out to tell the manager about the mismeasured dungeon, and to cancel the competition. But he learns that Sian hasn't cleared her dungeon yet. It shows Sian is confused that nothing is in her dungeon. Jun is confused that she hasn't come out, and realizes something is off. And he thought that the dungeon having a manticore was a scheme from Sian's side. Another manager realizes the dungeon has upgraded to a 4-star, and Jun remembers what the Sword Saint said about the distortion previously. One of the managers tries to talk to Jun, but realizes he's gone, and it cuts to Sian missing her arm. And a 6-star monster leaning over her. As it goes to finish her, we see Jun block the monster. He tells her to run away, and she asks what he's doing here. Jun struggles, but yells at the monster and lures it away. He blocks another attack, and realizes if it hits him it'll be game over. Han thinks that now he's used to its attack pattern if he just continues to deflect the attacks, but his thought is interrupted as the goat monster stabs him. It flings him towards Sian, and he tells her he'll buy her time again, and she asks why he's going so far, and says that it has nothing to do with him. And we learn that she hates people who try to act like heroes, because her brother died. Jun tells her that what she's done is bad, but she doesn't deserve to die. And this shocks her, and he says, what better prize is there than saving people's lives? We see the monster charging at them, and Jun remembers Chiron's teachings about intuition. And decides to leave the judgment to his intuition. And that combining thoughts and intuition is the true way for an ascended to rely on intuition. He dodges the monster's attack, and we see the attack breaks the floor. Jun receives a cut, but realizes he can see where the next attack will be. He blocks another attack, and starts to feel the monster's movement. He dodges again, and he understands that if he continues to hold on, a pro will arrive, but he wonders how much longer Sian will last. With this in mind, he decides that he has to defeat the monster. He uses Shen Yu's teachings, and rushes at the monster, but the monster lets out a roar. Jun realizes that he cannot win with only Shen Yu's teachings, and forces aura onto his weapon. He lands a hit on the monster and defeats it, which shocks Sian. He gains a lot of lecture progress, and begins carrying Sian back. And he tells her he came in to save her, but hopes they don't die. She's quiet, so he makes a joke saying he hopes he didn't waste his efforts. One of the managers asks what happened, and Jun tells them to just get the medical team. Sian tells him that she'll never think of him as her savior, and that she did nothing wrong. He tells her he wasn't expecting anything for helping her, and we see her get carried off on a stretcher. Due to the news of what happened, and how a 6-star monster appeared in a 2-star dungeon, this was the first time there was such a big gap between stars. And due to the popularity, people began to wonder who Jun was for being able to defeat it. We see one of Kalia's henchmen tell her that the apostle is looking for her, and it has to be related to the distortion. It cuts to Jun in the hospital, and he's wondering why he saved her, and he should have made her do other challengers so he could have gotten the prize money. Yun walks in and asks what's wrong with Jun, and when Mancho explains, he doesn't want to split the prize money. She asks him why he would have to do that when he's the only winner. And that Sian forfeited, and even reported the cheating that she did. Which confuses Jun. And we learn that she told Yun that she thinks both hers and Jun's way of thinking is incorrect. Yun also mentions how there is an additional bonus added to the prize pool, and this excited Jun. She also tells him that her academy has been promoted too, and she thanks Jun. Once they leave, he begins to browse the Transcendent shop. Jun remembers the spear is 100k, but he doesn't know how much his free pass cost for his lectures, and that waiting too long will make things worse. He browses through the equipment, and he realizes he can't figure out what the equipment does because they have no descriptions, so he browses the community for Transcended cadets, and he finds a post about the gear. Out of all of the equipment, he stumbled upon an item called Kib Isis, and the review says pretty much the entire post was just to get people to buy this one item, and that it's a subspace pouch, with many different effects, and you should purchase it early, and that it decreases weight by 70%, but the space is wide. Jun realizes that it's really convenient for doing squats, as the pouch will not get bulky, it's a perfect size for squats. He buys it. 3 days later, we see Jun with the spear, and his Kib Isis pouch. We learn he used all of his money on the items, and Yun asks him why he isn't resting, and he says there's no point, and he needs to earn money, because he's already spent all the prize money. This shocks her, and she sees his new spear and realizes what he spent it on. We see the two of them in a 4-star dungeon, and he notices some statues guarding a chest, and realizes they are gargoyles. He dashes at them, and he decides to just swing and see how the weapon is without his power, and he cleanly halves the gargoyle, which confuses him. And they both look at each other and ask what happened. So-yoon is dumbfounded, and she wonders why the gargoyles are getting sliced like tofu, and she gets even more shocked watching him shove their bodies into his pouch. She asks where he bought the items, and he tells her it's some back alley shop, and she gets excited to visit it. And he tells her the store is closing because the owner is going on a journey. And we see a perfectly normal serious face to indicate that he totally isn't lying to her. They finally make their way to a big foyer, and see multiple gargoyles around them. So-yoon thinks about how strong his spear is without his power, and wonders what it would be like with his powers, and we see the gargoyles leap at him, and he gathers mana into the tip of his spear, which shocks So-yoon. He sends the attack out, and we see it hit all of the gargoyles, pretty much obliterating them. So-yoon is shocked, and we see the attack left a giant crater in the floor. We learn the Spear of Longinus is the spear that stabbed Jesus, and is also known as the Holy Lance, and due to being a copy, he thought it was going to be weak, but that wasn't the case at all. So-yoon tells So-jun that Jimin, the magic saint's disciple, wants to meet him. And we learn a little about her, and how the magic saint says that she has already surpassed him. So-yoon mentions how she had to stop her from barging in, and So-jun wonders if she is like the sword saint, but So-yoon quickly tells him that isn't the case. He says if that's the case, then okay, he'll meet her. So-yoon texts Jimin to tell her So-jun agrees, and we see a beam of light, and Jimin appears, saying she's here. We see Jimin yelling no way after seeing So-jun, wondering where he got something, and she yells a bit more. Seon-yoon says that she gets like that when she really wants to know something, and then introduces her to him. So-jun mentions how Jimin is meant to be in her 40s, but looks so young. And we learn she uses magic to maintain her appearance of when she was young. Jimin mentions how since she has memories of her form, she just uses that. And she asks him where he got his subspace pouch, and he holds it out for her. So-jun wonders if it's that impressive, and she yells an entire essay into his ear. She offers him 100 million for it, and he tells her he cannot sell it. She asks why, and he gives it to her so she can try using it, and it shocks her. So not only can only he use it, nobody else can even touch it. This impresses her even more, and she says if he tells her where he bought it he'll give her $1 million. She looks suspicious of his story about buying it in an alley, and she asks him to at least let her research the pouch. And offers to pay him for letting her research. And he wonders if that is okay. Because if he tries to hand ownership, they'll be shocked, but if it's just researching, he wonders if it's possible. He tells her if she gets the money, he'll help her, and asks if they should start now. She tells him she needs her equipment, and that she'll invite him to her lab later. And she remembers why she came there in the first place. And asks him to explain everything about the distortion. She asks how he defeated the goat monster, and he tells her he was lucky. He thinks to himself if it weren't for Merlin's mana, he wouldn't have been able to do it. He asks Jimin if aura and magic are both based on mana, and asks her if that would be the same for a distortion. He explains further by saying that if magic and aura are just different ways of using mana, wouldn't a distortion be the same? And how Merlin's lectures mention that using mana is distorting the laws of the world using individual will. And that distortion could have happened based on someone's will. And rather than distortions being natural phenomena, they could be the work of a person. He wonders what he's doing, and tells her to take it with a grain of salt. And she asks if he's also a magic scholar, and he tells her no, he's an aspiring hunter. And she asks what's with his description, and is surprised by how he can differentiate aura and magic. And she asks if he was the one to make the pouch, and he wonders what kind of bullshit she is spouting. Jimin asks how he thought of all this, and continues to ask questions, and So-jun suddenly has the thought and wonders how much money he could earn from teaching others. He realizes he has to understand the material before teaching. So-yoon comes back, and Jimin leaves the office, and So-yoon and So-jun eat. It cuts to him at the academy, and he's wondering why his lecture progress isn't going up. He goes to ask So-yoon something, but she's wondering what to do about getting a lecturer, and she's so absorbed she doesn't hear him. He startles her, and he asks what she's thinking about. She asks him what he needs, and he asks if there's a competition coming up soon. She says there isn't one within the next 20 days, but there's a mock exam next month. A mock exam is an exam academies make to prepare their cadets for the hunter exams. And because the academies are some of the top ones, everyone watches the mock exam, and there are rumors that the score you get is the same as in the pro hunter exams. Saw Jun realizes that there will be more cadets like Junwan, and the prize money will be given in the form of scholarships, and it just so happens to be during the time his free pass ends. He decides to see how far he goes. It cuts to Saw Jun listening to lectures, and he hears Chiron mention how the mock exam is approaching soon, and this shocks Saw Jun. He sees a pop-up mentioning the exam, and he recalls the cadet interview, and says he thought it was a skit. He doesn't think there's a reason for him to take their exam, and it'd be better for him to progress his lecture instead. Shenyu pops on his screen and says everyone should get ready for their exams, and he then wonders if all of the other professors are mentioning the exam too, and they are. He wonders if the exam is really that important, and decides to look on the forums. He sees a post similar to his, and he sees a comment mentioning how the exam will help a lot with lecture progress. And he wonders if he should try it out. It cuts to Saw Jun holding his phone, and a prompt tells him the first time taking the exam is free, and he accepts it. He chooses some options for the exam, and the first subject starts instantly, which shocks him. He looks around and wonders how the exam will start there, and his phone begins to glow, and a black hole forms. He throws his phone. He watches as the monster grows larger and larger out of his phone, and the monster is revealed to be a dragon. His time limit is 30 minutes, and the dragon's throat begins to glow, and it shoots out fire toward him, and we see a blue flame hit Saw Jun directly. Another status window appears saying failure, and Saw Jun is surprised and rolls around on the floor. He wonders how the other levels will be because it's only level 1, and there is 10 total. And that it wasn't just an ordinary dragon, but the dragon of ruin, and he remembers that some of the transcended are gods. He wonders what to do now and is happy that he has 10 more attempts left. While he doesn't think much will change, he wants to see how it will go. The failure screen pops up multiple times, and now he has 5 times left. He rolls around on the floor again, confused about what to do. He gets a lecture pop-up mentioning how a lecture on the mock exam. One of the lecturers is from Wukong, and he watches it. Wukong explains that, in reality, it's not that difficult. He says that if you can avoid the breath attack, there's nothing to Fafnir except that. He says watch this while standing in front of Fafnir, and he says don't think of splitting the breath apart, but all you have to do is dodge it. And now he cannot use it again for a while, so he becomes a lizard, so just beat him up. We see Wukong demonstrate one of his abilities called Meteor Grand Fall, and we see a big light emanating from his staff that destroys Fafnir. Wukong says, simple, right, and the more difficult it is, the simpler you should think about it, which confuses Saw Jun. And he has an existential crisis, so he watches another lecture on face to breath, which leaves Saw Jun confused again. He wonders what to do now, and sees another lecture this time. It's from the first dragon slayer Siegfried, the man who killed Fafnir. The lecture starts with Siegfried talking about Fafnir's breath attack, and he explains, similar to Wukong, that the only attack is the breath attack, so it depends on whether you can dodge it. And if they are attending the lecture, it means they are having a hard time with dodging it, so he will explain 2 attack methods. 1 is Fafnir will fire his breath attack where you were summoned, and if you dash after being summoned, you can dodge it. And if you find dodging difficult, the second method is for you. He says to prepare gold because Fafnir is extremely greedy, and that's how he became a dragon. It doesn't need to be real gold, but throw it, because he won't fire his breath attack in fear of melting the gold. Siegfried mentions that if they need more help with dragon slaying, to visit his other lectures. Saw Jun realizes he has nothing to lose anyways, and decides to try again. We see him holding a bar of gold in front of Fafnir, and he instantly throws the gold, like an MLB pitcher, directly at Fafnir. He totally falls for it, and is like a dog playing fetch. He runs after the gold, and turns around, and smacks Saw Jun. He fails again, and now he has 4 attempts left, and wonders if he should make armor out of gold. It cuts to Saw Jun jumping over Fafnir, and struggling to dodge all of his attacks. Fafnir begins to swipe his tail at him, and he realizes it's too late to dodge, so he reaches into his pouch and throws gold out for Fafnir. Fafnir instantly turns around, angry, and Saw Jun throws more gold for him. While Fafnir is distracted, Saw Jun jumps above him, and uses P-Tum, imbuing mana into his spear. He lands on Fafnir and stabs him in the back, but the attack does nothing but sting Fafnir, and he fails again. But his lecture progress has gone up. Saw Jun has failed the battle exam, and wonders how the next one will go. He starts it, and he sees a red pearl in his hands. The exam this time is to flee from the emoji while holding the pearl. The exam is for him to not be hit at all by the emoji, and it instantly bites him, causing him to fail. He moves on to the third exam, and its goal is to defeat or survive the Sphinx. It asks him something, but he can't understand it. Saw Jun asks if the answer is man, and it smacks him. He fails, and goes to the next subject, which is providing mana to the Bulgasari. We see Saw Jun feeding the Bulgasari mana, and Saw Jun runs from it. The next exam is him listening to the siren song for the duration of the test. We see a siren singing, and he says it's actually enjoyable, and he passes the first level. Level 2 is listening to Helheim's Requiem, but it's really bad, so he fails. He looks at his exam progress, and lecture progress, and we see he's close to finishing 2 of the lectures. Mentor appears out of his phone, and says it's been a while, scaring Saw Jun. He asks Mentor why he's so late, and he says he was going to come back earlier, but Saw Jun's profile is pathetic, and that at Saw Jun's current level, he cannot help him, so it'd be better if he focused on the 2 lectures he recommended the first time. Mentor asks if he is focusing on his lectures, and then is shocked when he looks at his progress, asking if it's a bug. Because it says, he's taking 4 lectures. Saw Jun tells him it's true, and that the information on the screen is right. Mentor asks how he pulled it off with such a low level, and that it should take him longer for this much progress. Saw Jun mentions that the mock exam helped him with his progress, and Mentor asks if he's taking the mock exam right now. Mentor looks devastated and says it looks like he didn't need him after all. Saw Jun asks him how to choose a subject, and Mentor says you just choose the subject you want, and is confused why it shows undecided for him. Saw Jun also mentions how he doesn't have a Transcension Academy ID, and Mentor asks how he doesn't have one. And Saw Jun holds his phone up, showing that he doesn't have an ID, so he can't make a post. Mentor says he'll have to bring it up to the principal, and that he'll be back, so finish up on the mock exam. He makes a joke about going for milk, and fixes Saw Jun's exam so he can choose what he wants. We now see new subjects on his phone, and it cuts to him having completely obtained the P-Tum technique. Saying no way, he swipes his spear, and creates a giant mana wave easily, and comments on how naturally it flows. He gets a notification for an epilogue lecture, and Shen Yu says that everyone is probably noticing a lot of changes within their bodies, and that P-Tum is the most basic of basics, but don't let it get to your head, because you are still trash. But this is something to be congratulated about, and now you can officially learn a spear technique. And that the path will be hard, but don't worry, there are no set paths. Which means to trust in your decision, and that it's a marathon, not a sprint. It cuts to So-Yoon mentioning how the mock exam is accepting applications, and that he tells her to go ahead. She tells him the exam will start in 10 days. He gets really close to her face, and wonders what would happen if they spar now. He quickly asks her how the recruitment of new cadets is going, and she says she's worried about it. Because there's no telling how her grandpa will act about it. And that she's worried about what lecturer to invite for him, and she mentions how lecturers are expensive, and he asks how much they make. She tells him, and his greed overwhelms him, and he tells her if she needs help to ask him. It cuts to 3 days later, and he's finished Shen Yu's lecture, and while he looks at his phone, Mentor pops up, and is a little sad that Saw Jun isn't surprised. Saw Jun tells him he finished one of his lectures, and this shocks Mentor. And he tells him there's a big problem. Mentor says that before he went to the principal, he looked for Saw Jun's information, but couldn't find it. There's no information for him in the academy. Saw Jun asks how he's able to take lecturers then, and Mentor says he's confused too, because the academy uses a strict screening process, so if he weren't properly screened, Mentor wouldn't be there. Saw Jun asks if it's a system error, and Mentor says, it can't be. But there are traces of someone interfering, but they don't know who. And that even the principal didn't know about it. Saw Jun asks if he'll be expelled, and Mentor tells him no, it's an issue on their end, and once a member, always a member. Saw Jun is relieved it isn't a system error, and wonders who it could have been. Saw Jun asks what he should do because his free pass is ending soon. Mentor explains how the academy curriculum is split into 4 levels, and explains what they are. Saw Jun asks if after he breaks through the upper level, if he'll be a transcended, and Mentor says no, there are many other steps after the upper level. He asks Saw Jun if he'll keep a spear as his weapon in the next level, and recommends that he takes Hercules, and Zhang Sanfeng's lecture. We see the fees are expensive, and Mentor says he needs to work hard to gain causality, and explains that it is a justification, and Saw Jun asks what the Academy gains out of it. And Mentor says it's to help cadets become transcendents, and Saw Jun asks him why that's the case. Mentor says that there's not much more he can help due to Saw Jun's current basis, and to increase his causality and he'll know what he means. And that to work hard, because he supports him. Before he goes, Saw Jun asks if there are other cadets, and Mentor says of course, but he understands Saw Jun probably means in the same dimension, and Mentor says out of all the dimensions, the dimension with the most number of cadets is 4. Saw Jun covers the academies again, and mentions how the academy holding the exam is Mills. Due to the price of the exam, Saw Jun has no other choice, but to place first in this exam because he needs the money. It shows a couple of hunters, one is Kim Gan-chul, and the other is a man carrying a variety of different weapons who gets dragged away after causing a commotion. The first subject is on endurance, and it has the participants all running on a track, and what's important is how many times you finish the 3 kilometers goal. It shows Saw Jun saying how easy the race is, and it cuts to him performing squats. Everyone looks on in confusion, as he's easily squatting a bar-bending amount. He's amazed by how much stronger P. Tums has made him, and cannot wait to see what Hercules' lecture is like. We learn that to those with certain abilities, the mock exam doesn't matter. Those people are Li Dan, Kim Gan-chul, and Jin Dongmin. And they are only participating as a performance. We learn that Kim Gang-chul is participating because someone from the Order of Truth told him to watch over Saw Jun, and Gang-chul has no clue who he is, but recalls meeting him and saying he looks useless. He walks into a room, and we see from the result board, that Saw Jun is in first place. This shocks Gang-chul, because there is such a big gap between him and Saw Jun, and because he's not in second, but in third place. And he wonders who the guy in second place is too. He reminds himself to calm down because the other subjects won't be the same way, and it shows the combat scores, which has him in third place still. The third subject is mana proficiency, and Saw Jun says he isn't confident in mana. Dawn passes by him, and people fangirl over her. She begins to prepare a fire spell, and sends it flying into the measuring device, which puts her at number 1 for mana proficiency currently. The crowd begins to talk about how nobody is a match for her, and one of the stagehands calls for Saw Jun. He passes Dawn on stage, and she smirks, thinking he can't beat her. Saw Jun says he isn't confident, but he'll try his hardest. He begins to concentrate his mana into his spear, and we can see it glowing. It shows Dawn watching him, and Saw Jun remembers Merlin's teachings, and charges at the measuring device. He slashes at it, but it is cut in half a lot easier than he was expecting, causing a shockwave to erupt from it. Dawn and the crowd are confused, and it shows that Saw Jun is now in first place. We learn that because the measuring device was broken, they had to pause the test, because they didn't expect it to be broken, so there is no spare. It shows the final results again, and we see the crowd is shocked that it isn't someone from the 3 academies in first place. The people in the crowd begin to recognize him as the man who cleared the distorted dungeon. We see So Yoon is excited by how much of a gap he's formed between the contestants. It cuts to Saw Jun wondering if it's the spear that cut through the measuring device, or if it's from his mana, so he wonders if he should buy a second weapon to compare. He wonders who has been singing, and sees the man with all of the weapons on his back, and recognizes him from before. The man notices Saw Jun and runs up to him, and introduces himself as Lee Min-yul, the man in second place. Min-yul apologizes for speaking informally, and Saw Jun is relieved that Min-yul didn't approach him for a grudge or anything, but because his personality is weird. The fourth subject is a dungeon raid, and it evaluates how fast someone can clear a dungeon. It's revealed that the monsters they need to hunt are 10 of the goat men from the Distortion. Saw Jun easily kills one, and we see him begin to slice up some more of them. He's strong enough now that he can easily defeat them, and that they were weaker than the real thing. He mentions how 3 months ago, he was a normal person, but now his life has begun to change. We see him standing over their corpses, and that he's still number 1 on the total scoring. All the other participants from the big guilds, except Gang-chul, show clear disdain towards Saw Jun, but Min-yul is cheerful with him. Saw Jun asks what's the deal with all of his weapons, and Minhyul explains because he hasn't learned from anyone, he doesn't have a specialty, so he just uses them all. Saw Jun is surprised that Minhyul is a self-taught cadet, and asks him why he hasn't joined an academy with his talent. Minhyul says he does have a master, but the man isn't aware that he has a disciple. As Saw Jun goes to ask about it, he is interrupted by one of the staff mentioning a problem. The staff hand mentions the people that were meant to be the judges had to stop a dungeon break, and that everyone needs to wait until they make a decision on how to proceed. Gangchul thinks to himself that it must be the Order of the Truth who did this, and that there is a chance the exam will end early, because then Saw Jun will become winner without the tournament finishing. With this in mind, Gangchul suggests a tournament to finish the exam, and tries to convince the staff hand that if the exam ends so abruptly, it'll reflect poorly on them. But he really just doesn't want the top 3 guilds having their names tarnished. And he thinks he'll beat Saw Jun in front of everyone. Others agree, and Saw Jun says that they should add extra prize money for it. The tournament starts, and a bunch of no-name people get eliminated by the top 3, and they all want to take Saw Jun down. We see Saw Jun thinking about the prize, and with this money, he might be able to register for his next class faster. He says he's not worried about the top 3, but he is worried about Minhyul. It shows Minhyul shooting arrows at his opponent, and when his opponent closes the gap, Minhyul uses 2 swords and blocks his attack, and sends the man backward. Saw Jun recognizes that Minhyul is just brawling, and that they are similar. Saw Jun wonders if he's also a cadet from Transcension Academy. He mentions how what Minhyul said about the master makes sense if it was from lectures. Minhyul wins his match, and the next match is Dawn and Saw Jun. We learn that Dawn is a genius, and that she is one of the top 5 cadets at her academy, and she is acknowledged as following Jimin's footsteps, and to Dawn, the word impossible didn't exist. She thinks to herself that the only reason she isn't in first place is because the mock exams aren't a good representation for mages. Is what she thought, and it shows her get gradually more confused as we see Saw Jun cut her fireball in half. She is confused that he cut magic apart, and it means either he used overwhelming amounts of mana, or he used a dispel. It cuts to Saw Jun thinking about how there has to be something special about the spear. We see Dawn cast a lot of fire arrows in front of him, and she sends them all down toward him. He easily cuts them all, which makes her hasty, and we see her spam more arrows, screaming for them to hit. But Saw Jun just cuts them all apart, and she drops her staff and falls to her knees, just utterly defeated mentally. Saw Jun puts his spear to her neck and asks if he won, and she calls him a monster. He's declared the winner. It shows Minhyul and Dogman exchanging blows, and Minhyul punches him in his side, causing him to fall to the floor. Minhyul is declared the winner. Gangchul realizes the Order of Truth's goal is to have Saw Jun and Minhyul fight, and he wonders if Minhyul is connected to the Order of Truth, and the next match begins. Gangchul and Saw Jun both walk onto stage, and Gangchul says he'll stop the Order's plan. Their fight starts, and Saw Jun blocks Gangchul's attack. The force from the attack shatters the arena floor. They distance themselves from each other. Gangchul leaps back in and unleashes a flurry of blows. Saw Jun blocks them all, and Gangchul steps in closer and unleashes a mana attack, destroying more of the arena. Saw Jun realizes it's not a bluff that Gangchul is part of the top 3, and decides to actually try. We see a menacing aura, and dashes in at Gangchul. Gangchul comments on how Saw Jun's usual aura is calm, like the ocean, but his current aura feels like that of an eruption from a volcano. Gangchul gets pushed back by Saw Jun's relentless attacks. Gangchul comments on how the attacks are just simple spear swings, and Saw Jun thrusts his spear, knocking Gangchul back. Gangchul wonders why simple attacks are so strong, and he realizes Saw Jun isn't using his aura, and the thought of that terrifies him. Gangchul compares it to a previous time, and we see him kneeling in front of someone, and how he recalls feelings of hopelessness. Gangchul gets angry and pours everything he is into his sword while charging at Saw Jun. He screams die, and we see Saw Jun infusing mana into his spear. It shows Gangchul's sword falling into pieces while the crowd is shocked, and Gangchul falls to his knees. And Saw Jun is declared the winner. Minhyul is excited by this. We see some of the crowd commenting on how they thought Saw Jun was overgeared, but now they know he's just really skilled. The finals begins with Saw Jun and Minhyul. Saw Jun asks him about the situation he mentioned previously with his master, and asks who it is, which upsets Minhyul, but Saw Jun says he might know his master. Jun thinks that even if it's part of the academy, it doesn't mean they are friends, and it's better if they are competitors. Jun asks him a question while making a nod to the academy. And Minhyul asks how he knows, and bets that whoever loses must answer questions for the winner. The fight begins, and Minhyul dashes at him with a sword. Jun decides to go all out from the start, and we see him slice toward Minhyul. He blocks it, but it breaks his sword in the process. He does a flip to avoid the attack. And stumbled backward. Jun uses this chance to get close, but is greeted with a shower of arrows. He quickly deflects them. Minhyul asks about his weapon, and if he'll talk about it after he wins. And they clash again, and Jun says of course. Both of them begin to trade an onslaught of blows, creating a storm of sparks from their weapons colliding. Jun mentions how he doesn't sense any desperation for Minhyul to win. Jun asks if he doesn't want to win, and Minhyul says that's not the case, and he really wants to beat him, but it's also okay if he loses. Jun asks if that's the case why he's using such cheap tricks to win, and Minhyul says that's just him trying his best. Jun mentions how it doesn't look good to others, and Minhyul said he doesn't care what others think. He knows his worth. Jun recalls some of Buddha's lecture because of Minhyul's words, and the flashback is Buddha talking about seeing the world from someone else's perspective. Jun remembers all of his hard work improving, and his daily struggle, and how he felt so much pressure to work harder than last time. In order to not fall behind, in order to survive in life. He receives minor enlightenment from Minhyul's words, and he wonders why he never thought about things from that type of perspective. Jun puts his weapon back into kibisis, and pulls out a normal spear. Jun asks if praise from others doesn't increase his worth, and that he decides his own worth. Minhyul says he's a better friend than he thought, and drops all of his weapons. Minhyul says he's right, and he hopes he doesn't take this as an insult. And he holds a dagger saying, this is the only thing his master taught him, and he's confident in it. They collide in the middle, and they both say, I just have to win. Minhyul knocks Jun's spear up, and dashes in at him, and unleashes an insanely quick flurry of stabs, almost each one grazing Jun, cutting him. Jun mentions how the Lance of Longinus would be enough to just instantly break his attacks apart, but now that he put it up, it's dangerous. And that Minhyul's ever-changing attacks are difficult to respond to. And we see Jun stop the dagger with his hand. We see Minhyul gets pushed back, and Jun thinks to himself it's okay to lose, but that he'll do his best to win. Jun swipes at him, and he flips over him. And he swiped back at Jun, but it is dodged. We see the attack knocks a lot of dust up, and blocks Jun's vision. Allowing for Minhyul to disappear, Jun catches a glimpse of him, and thinks this is his final trump card. Jun uses Merlin's mana, and infuses it into his spear. He notices something from Minhyul's previous fights, and wonders if this is the right way to handle the situation. And he realizes his fighting style is too rigid. He recalls Merlin mentioning that if you make learning a habit, you'll impede your own self-expression because learning is accepting the way someone else expresses themselves. And says how long will you display the way others express themselves? And he realizes he shouldn't be dragging out Merlin's mana, but his own. He decides to use his own methods, and he uses both Merlin's and Kriyun's, Shen Yu's, and Buddha's teachings and creates something that doesn't belong to anyone else. And we see his eyes glowing orange, and he emanates a new aura onto his spear. Everyone goes crazy in the crowd because of him creating an aura blade, including Soyun. We see Minhyul's pov of him getting closer to Jun, but he turns his head and looks directly at him. We see the spear goes toward Minhyul, breaking his stealth. We see the attack splits around Minhyul, avoiding him, and Minhyul's dagger is broken. And he declares his defeat. It cuts to Kalia being notified that Jun won. She asks if they noticed any distortions, and the man notifies her about Jun's aura blade, which is a shock to Kalia. She tells the man to continue monitoring Jun. It cuts to her receiving orders from a robed man to watch over Jun, and when she asks why he pressures her, and tells her she's forgetting her place. And he tells her it is not his will, he mentions to her he knows that she's been doing work without approval, but anything related to Jun she must report. And she says the only person who can control an apostle like that is that man, and it cuts back Jun talking to Soyun. She asks about the aura blade, and he tells her he was lucky. He also notices Minhyul being swarmed by academy offers, and Minhyul runs behind Jun, saying he's going to Soyun's academy. And Saw Jun and So Yoon are confused, and Minhyul tells them to run quickly. It shows them hiding from the recruiters, and Saw Jun asks why he said that, and Minhyul says he did not have the thoughts of joining the same academy as Saw Jun. And the wording gives Saw Jun WTF.exe face. And he tells him they can talk about it later, and asks if he remembers their promise. Saw Jun asks about his mentor, and Minhyul says he doesn't know, and confuses Saw Jun. Minhyul says that he didn't learn from him directly, and explains how he met his master when he was training in the mountains. He felt the presence of someone else and saw a man lying in a field, and ran up to him. Minhyul asks the man if he's alright, and notices blood on his hands. Minhyul says he'll take him to a hospital, but the man tells him no. Minhyul treated the man at an abandoned house in the mountains, and took care of the man, and nursed him back to health. And at first, his condition was severe, but he noticed the man recovering over time. It cuts to a month later, and Minhyul says it'd be nice if the grandpa recovered his consciousness, and as he approaches the building, he hears people talking. A group of men surround the grandpa, and ask if someone helped him. The grandpa says they don't need to know, and they ask if it's the greenhorn hiding behind the tree, meaning they noticed Minhyul. The grandpa instantly kills one of them, and then swiftly kills some more of the group, not giving them a chance to retaliate. One of them yells for everyone to kill him, and we see a group of them lunge at the grandpa. And Minhyul comments on how it's the first time he's seen someone fight so well, and it cuts back to his flashback. We see one of the group members are still alive, and says this isn't how the plan was meant to go. The grandpa tells Minhyul to run, and to never come back. And they both disappear. Minhyul, confused by the situation, grabs his belongings from the house, and notices a book the grandpa forgot, so he takes it too. And mentions how he planned to return it to him, but hasn't seen him again. Saw Jun asks why he calls him his master then, and Minhyul says because he saw the man's most sacred text, which had his martial arts. So Yoon says that his master may be a man called the Dark Saint, and that the man is just like the Sword Saint, so he's one of the 5 heroes that represent Korea, and he's very hidden. Saw Jun asks if she's met him, and she says that he's visited her grandpa a few times, and Minhyul is shocked to have learned her grandpa is the Sword Saint, and asks for her help in finding his master. Saw Jun uses his winnings, and buys the free pass, and notices his lecturers have reached 100%, and he gains a skill from Chiron called Metamorphosis. And he excitedly moves around, but is instantly confused when he doesn't notice a change. While mentioning how different Metamorphosis is in novels, he feels a snake-like presence, and turns around to see nothing. But he hears a voice saying, "I can't believe it, you were able to notice my existence, but it doesn't seem like you can see my form. Is it your natural sense?" And the voice says, "Don't be worried, I am not here to kill you." Saw Jun asks who it is, and the voice says, "You would definitely be a hard opponent for that stripling." Saw Jun puts the words together and asks if the man is the Dark Saint, and he sees the man come from the shadows. The Dark Saint says he's quick on the uptake, and it's surprising he noticed his presence. Saw Jun asks if he found him because of Minhyul. The Dark Saint says he was just on his way, and Saw Jun comments on how he left his sacred text behind on purpose, and the Dark says nothing good will come of Minhyul telling people it was his sacred text. Saw Jun tells him that Minhyul had no idea who he was, and this makes the Dark Saint call him an idiot. Saw Jun tells him Minhyul will be there soon, and asks him to wait and greet him. The Dark Saint says that if that's the case, he doesn't have much time. And if he wanted to meet Minhyul, he would have done it before, and he came to see him to ask if he has a connection to the Order of Truth. Saw Jun mentions how he only met Kalia once, and the Dark Saint says that for a while, he's been tracing the steps for the Order of Truth. Because he doesn't trust them. And he brings up the great monster the Order of Truth hunted. And he tells Saw Jun that Berserk did not die that day. He mentions that Berserk isn't a monster that can be killed, and they don't even have proof, or the body to prove it. And that the monster just suddenly disappeared. Saw Jun says if that's the case, why do people say the Order of Truth saved humanity? And the Dark Saint mentions how the Grand Voice did something to Berserk. And he asks Saw Jun if he's ever wondered why the Apostle of Chastity's seat is empty, and how the original Apostle of Chastity disappeared like Berserk did. And in order to find the truth out, he's learned 2 things. 1. The Order was trying to kill him for investigating, and 2. The recent 10-star break was their scheme, and they did it because of Saw Jun. Saw Jun asks him why he's telling him all of this, and says he came to ask for him to take care of Minhyul for him. And mentions how they have a special thing called watching, which is when they can see the results of their target's action. And because he's one of their targets, anyone he talks to will have his trace on them. Saw Jun says he doesn't have his trace on him too, and the Dark Saint says he's an exception, because they can't watch him. He hands Saw Jun a book, saying he has no time, and to give it to Minhyul. And he goes to give Saw Jun another copy for him to learn, and he says he doesn't need it, and asks for something else. And asks the Dark Saint for child support. This confuses the Dark Saint, and Saw Jun says if he doesn't give him money he won't do it. Saw Jun asks him for 3 million, and the Dark Saint calls him crazy. Saw Jun drops some bars onto him about how he's the only one who can do it, and believes he should be receiving 3 million as compensation. He asks if he can tell Minhyul about him, and he says it doesn't matter if he does or not, but he needs to tell Minhyul not to mention him to anyone else. As soon as he disappeared, Minhyul arrives, and it cuts to after Saw Jun tells him everything. He's surprised his master is really the Dark Saint, and Saw Jun hands him the book. Minhyul asks why he handed him the book, and Saw Jun tells him that the Dark Saint asked him to. Minhyul mentions how he could have just kept it to himself, and Saw Jun says doing something like that is mean. Minhyul says he's decided, and we see his eyes full of respect, saying he wants to join Saw Jun's academy starting today. Minhyul tells So Yoon that he's planning to enroll in her academy, and she says that's good news for her. Saw Jun thinks this is good, because he'll train with the secret book the Dark Saint gave him. And that he can get more money from the Saint if he keeps hanging out with Minhyul. And that he'll be a golden goose, and we see a funny image. So Yoon says it seems like they can enter team-based contests, and she mentions the rewards. Saw Jun turns into an anime girl, and says we have to do it. 3 days later, see Hercules, benching a pillar, and he says he'll keep the introduction short. He says he's Hercules, and he says that a physical body is the most important, and that the people who think that the bigger you are, the slower you are wrong. And that it's not true. And that speed and strength all come from muscle power. He crouches down and tells them to watch, and we see him perform a move called lightning speed. And mentions that it comes from the lower limb, and strength comes from the upper limbs. And we see him performing some rapid movement, and mentions how stamina comes from muscles too. He receives his daily mission, and is surprised it isn't much different from Chiron's, but notices at the bottom it says it only recognizes a weight of 1 ton. Saw Jun rubs his eyes to see if he read it properly and transforms into a stickman. He watches the next lecture from Jang Sambong, who is an elder of the Wudong sect. And he mentions what foot techniques are, and what it is in reference to. Sambong gives some examples, and begins to walk into the sky. And says that by using your inner energy, you can use your feet to step on air. And he says he'll explain later, so don't ponder too much on it currently. Saw Jun is surprised he can walk on the air like that. And he receives his daily mission from Sambong. And the requirements are absurd, but Saw Jun says it seems doable, and then says, never mind, I'm crazy. Someone appears and asks for Saw Jun, and it's Suyeon. She is introduced as Manchol's daughter. She asks if he's contacted her dad recently, and Manchol, and he asks why. And she says she's lost contact with him, and asks if he knows why. Saw Jun, concerned, asks how long it's been, and she says since he went to work yesterday. Saw Jun says maybe he's just asleep somewhere, and asks if something else has happened. She says she had a fight with her dad after telling him she wanted to be a hunter. She leaves, and he tells her to contact him with updates, and it cuts to him trying to call Manchol, but he doesn't answer. He says he'll wait another day. It cuts to Kalia talking about the Dark Saint, and asks about Saw Jun, and the man says they can't locate him. And Kalia begins to nervously bite her nail. And she says they cannot reveal the truth of the 10-star dungeon break, so proceed with the plan. It cuts back to Saw Jun in the training room, mentioning if he knew this would happen, he wouldn't have sold the monster corpses. And we see him storing weights into his pouch. He finally finishes and says now it should weigh more than a ton, but is quickly exhausted. He decides to use P. Tum and Merlin's mana to exercise, and it cuts to So-yoon just looking at him on the floor. She asks what he's doing, and he asks for her help, and asks how much he stuffed inside and tries to lift it, but doesn't move in the slightest. She uses mana, and Saw Jun manages to get out from under it. He asks her how tall the building is, and when she asks why he asked, he says he wants to jump off the roof. And tells her to wait a minute while he goes to try it, and she also turns into a confused stickman, and she hears a thud, and Saw Jun says, "So close." And she just listens as he repeatedly jumps off the roof, and walks away depressed, wondering what new students would think if they saw this, or if she'll even get some. Minhyul walks back in to see Saw Jun training, and wonders what happened in the time he just left. And they call him weird while he stares at his phone. Saw Jun is worried because Mancho hasn't responded yet, and it's been 4 days. He tells So Yoon he'll be back later, and she yells that if he's going to jump off the roof again, because there have been police reports about him. He tells her about Mancho, and he tells her he's not sure, but he'll let her know. He goes to his old work, and they compliment him, and he asks if they've seen Mancho recently. And they mention he disappeared after following someone, and they mention how a strange man came to the company. And that Mancho desperately needed money to pay for his daughter's tuition, so he took the shady job deal. He asks where he went, and they tell him the association should have info. Saw Jun thanks them for the information and runs off. The association tells them they can't hand out private information, and Saw Jun tells them that he's gone missing. The association man says he's sorry, and this angers Saw Jun. We see him sitting at a park wondering what to do, and that the strange man has to be the problem. And that he can't shake this ominous feeling he has, and he recalls his past events with Mancho. And how much he's helped him over the time he's known him. And how he handed him money after his accident, and when Saw Jun lost all of his savings, Mancho was the one who comforted him, and how he gave him money without hesitation, which made him who he is today. He calls So Yoon and asks if she can help him, and asks if he can meet her grandpa. It cuts to them face to face, and Grandpa Yoon asks if Saw Jun wants his help, and Saw Jun says no, but he challenges him to a duel. This shocks the people there, and Grandpa Yoon asks, "What?" Saw Jun explains that if he wins, he wants Grandpa Yoon to intervene beyond just helping. And that if he loses, he'll quit Dream Academy. Saw Jun says obviously, he can't win in a fair fight, so if he can inflict an injury, he hopes he'll consider it as win. Saw Jun recognizes that a normal person can't get information from the association, but if it's one of the 5 great heroes, it might be different. Grandpa Yoon says okay, and tells him to follow. We see him grabbing his sword, and we learn the sword is called the Azure Dragon Sword. And that it's a sword used by an ancient general named Kim Yushin, and even though the sword is a replica, it's a masterpiece created by Korea's best blacksmith. And the only time Grandpa Yoon brings it out is when he plans to kill his opponent. The assistant asks what he's planning to do, and if something happens, but is interrupted by Grandpa Yoon telling him not to worry, because Saw Jun is still a student. And he only plans to entertain him. So Yoon tells Saw Jun he doesn't need to do this, and that she'll try asking her grandpa, and Saw Jun tells her no. And he appreciates it, but this is necessary. And wonders if he's the reason Manchol disappeared. And in case this happens again, and he doesn't have the strength or authority to do anything about it. But if he can get people thinking the Sword Saint will act if something happens to those close to him, it might change things. He tells her he'll return after winning, and she goes to reach out to him, but stops and says he must win. We see them both inside of a sparring room, and Grandpa Yoon says, if he thinks he'll go easy on him, he better stop now. And Saw Jun says he just wants him to keep his promise. Grandpa Yoon draws his sword, and says he'll give him his first move. We see Saw Jun lunge down, and he dashes straight toward Grandpa Yoon. We see his weapon glowing, and he plans to go all out from the start. He slashes at him with all of his power, but it is easily blocked. And Grandpa Yoon asks, is that all that you've got? He sends Saw Jun flying backward, and he's recoiling from the shock, and Grandpa Yoon closes the gap and swings at him. Saw Jun dodges, and they exchange blows. This repeats, and they continuously trade blows with each other. Saw Jun recognizes that he's serious. And they continue exchanging blows. Saw Jun says each of his attacks, every movement, is like a final blow to him. And Grandpa Yoon uses a move called Sword Dance, and we see a giant mana wave emanating from his swing, causing a shockwave to startle the spectators. So Yoon yells out to Saw Jun, and we see him holding his spear up, commenting on how this is a true hero, Sword Saint. They continue to exchange a flurry of blows with each other, each time creating blue sparks. Grandpa Yoon comments how a few months ago, he was just a brat, and how before, he was just a typical student, but now what he's witnessing is that Saw Jun is improving himself with every single movement. He knocks Saw Jun's weapon back, and we see him swipe at Saw Jun, creating a massive shockwave from the swing, sending Saw Jun flying. and he notices that his weapon is holding against his aura, and that the fight would have ended if not for his weapon. And he decides to put a little effort into the fight, and dashes at Seo-jun. He does another swipe of his sword, creating an even bigger shockwave in the training area, and making Seo-jun cough up blood. Seo-jun realizes he was cocky to challenge him, just because he beat up a few students, and he failed to see reality. Because he didn't notice the massive gap between himself and the Sword Saint. And now he feels frustrated that he hasn't gone all out. We see him quickly dash behind Grandpa Yoon. He stabs at him, but is blocked. Grandpa Yoon asks why he challenged him, if this is all that he's got. Then knocks him back. Seo-jun says he looked up to the Sword Saint, and wanted to become like him. And respected how he gained his fame, but he was arrogant. He was too absorbed in the title of Transcendent and looked down on him. And we see him get sent flying back by a thrust from the Sword Saint. He acknowledges he's weaker than him, a lot weaker. But now he can finally evaluate his level, and someday he'll reach a higher height than him. Because he wants to go beyond him, and we see him dashing at the Sword Saint. He realizes something mid-dash, that he can't feel his hands, and his steps feel awkward. He wonders what this feeling is, and he sees the sword swing by his face. He sees a vision of himself being cut and drops his weapon. Seo-jun begins to run at him, and Seo-jun looks at Grandpa Yoon, saying he hopes he'll keep his promise, and he falls unconscious. And we see a wound on his cheek. He looks down to see Seo-jun on the floor, and then it cuts to Mancho carrying someone in a dungeon. He's saying that he was tempted by the money, and wouldn't have agreed if he knew this would happen. The man apologizes for the distortion, and says if he knew about it, he'd have come alone. Mancho says, to stop worrying, and that people must have noticed by now. The man says that won't happen because he's told the association not to disclose any information, and that it was a stupid choice to make. And that it'll be hard for them to make it out. Mancho smirks and says he's sure that guy would have struggled his way out, and that there's a silly guy. It cuts back to Seo-jun waking up, and he asks Seo-jun how long he's been out for. She says not for long, but he doesn't have the time to lie down anymore. Grandpa Yoon walks into the room, and gives Seo-jun his sword. He asks why he's giving him it, and he says he's simply upholding his process. And to show the sword to the association. It cuts to Seo-jun at the association sitting at a table with the association president, and the president is wondering why the Sword Saint's sword is there. Seo-jun introduces himself, and Seo-jun asks about Mancho, and asks to tell him which dungeon he entered. The president remembers that the person said not to tell anyone, and says they need to verify the sword. Seo-jun asks him if he'll take responsibility for the delay. The president reluctantly tells him the Magic Saint was the one who took Mancho, and they went to a 6-star dungeon to investigate. Seo-jun thanks him, and asks if he can use the sword as collateral for a loan. It cuts to him on the phone with Soo-yeon, and she's asking if he's contacted her father. He tells her he knows roughly where he is, and that there's been a problem. Soo-yeon begins to break down, and wonders how she's going to live by herself. Seo-jun tells her not to worry, that he'll bring him back. We see his bank is full of money, and at first, the association didn't want to loan money, but eventually, he convinced him to do it. And he plans to use the money to properly prepare for the dungeon. And we see him but a copy of the Lance Gungnir, and he heads into the dungeon. We see him inside of a forest, and he begins to use his senses to figure out where the monsters are. And he can sense some of the trees feel different from the others. He pulls out Gungnir and infuses it with mana, then launches it at one of the trees. We see it flying at the tree, and the tree begins to scream, and dodges the lance. This surprises Seo-jun, but the lance boomerangs back around and stabs it in the back, instantly killing the monster. We learn more about Gungnir, and how it's a weapon Odin used. Seo-jun says this much power is to be expected from a weapon a Transcendent made. And we see the trail the weapon left behind. And according to the legend, Gungnir has a recalling function, and it can never miss its target. Seo-jun puts his hand out and uses a little mana, and Gungnir flies back to his hand, and he says he can only use it once in battle due to how much mana it consumes. It cuts to Mancho running from some treants, and Mancho ends up tripping while carrying the Magic Saint. As the monsters go to attack him, the Magic Saint blocks the attacks with a barrier, and tells him to run away. Mancho asks what about him, and he says he doesn't have much time anyways, and that it's his fault he's in this situation. We see the barrier break, and Mancho grabs onto the saint, and Mancho apologizes to his daughter. In fear, Mancho closes his eyes, but when he opens them and looks up, he sees the back of Saw Jun. Saw Jun asks if he knows how much his daughter has been looking for him, and then tells Mancho to take the saint and leave. Saw Jun dodges some of the Trent's attacks, and has to find the main body. We see him narrowly dodging the attacks, and while he cuts it, he notices the treants are just regenerating all of his damage. He realizes he can't get close, so he has to use Gunjer to pierce its main body. He sees it on the floor, but notices that Mancho and the saint haven't gotten away yet. So he begins to twirl his spear as a defense. Once they've gotten far enough away, he dashes past the Trent's attacks, and makes his way to Gunjer. He grabs it, and yeets it at the monsters, instantly killing one of them. They continue to attack him, and he manages to deflect their attacks and attack back while taking minimal damage. He sees Gunjer and calls it back with mana, and we see it fly through the air toward him, and he catches it. He notices the monsters are afraid of Gungnir, and he plays Eeny Meeny Miny Mo, and kills one of the treants. And the rest begin to zerg him, and he uses this chance to slice them all in half together, with one swipe of his spear. While saying Gungnir isn't his only weapon. It cuts back to him meeting up with Mancho and the saint, and they make small talk, and Saw Jun notices the saint looks like he's in horrible condition, and feeds him his emergency medicine. And Mancho tells him he's the one he's mentioned previously, and the saint asks what happened with the treants. And is shocked when Saw Jun tells him he killed them all. Saw Jun asks why he brought Mancho with him, and he explains he was there for research, and he needed someone to carry the corpses, and he had to move as discreetly as possible. Saw Jun asks if it's because of the Order of Truth, and he asks how he knows about that, but is interrupted by a sound and we see Mancho begin to panic. And they look up to see a giant Trent. Saw Jun says they should avoid its gaze and leave the dungeon quickly, because it hasn't seen them yet. And they explain they've tried that, and when they tried to leave the monster caught up to them, and injured the saint. And the saint explains how the monsters outside is so thick he couldn't penetrate it, and even if he did it would just regenerate the damage. And that his magic didn't even have an effect. This shocks Saw Jun. The saint explains he's not who he used to be, he's old and weak, and it's embarrassing people call him the magic saint. And he mentions how they need a powerful attack to destroy his core. Saw Jun asks if that's all, and says he'll break the core, and the confused magic saint says a normal attack won't work, and that he can't incapacitate it, only weaken it. Saw Jun tells him to look at his weapon, and the saint turns into full Nurge mode. And he remembers Jimin was the same way, and that she's his disciple. And when asked where he got it, he lies and says the sword saint bought it for him. Saw Jun explains the plan is, 1. He will distract it, 2. The saint will weaken the monster, and 3. Gungnir stabs the monster. The end. We see them in front of the Trent preparing to start, and Saw Jun runs to the Trent, and he yells out to it. It turns around and launches some of its branch tentacles at him, and we see him dodge backward. This attack and dodge sequence repeats multiple times, and Saw Jun continues running around the Trent. While he wonders if the spell is ready, and the Trent attacks while he is distracted, but he dodges it. We see some branches come from the ground, and attack Saw Jun while he is dodging the previous attack, but Saw Jun cuts the branches, and runs down on them. We see him being overwhelmed by the monster's presence, and he receives a signal from the magic saint, which means the spell is ready. Saw Jun taunts the Trent again. Saw Jun continues to run from the Trent, narrowly dodging the attacks, and this repeats multiple times. And soon, he'll be at the area they have planned. We see chains come from the floor, and begin to restrict around the Trent. The Trent begins to swap targets to the Saint and Mancho, and Saw Jun realizes right now they are both weakened, so he pulls Gungnir out of his pouch, and realizes this is his only chance. He pours everything he is into Gungnir, and begins to clear his mind, too, while infusing the lance. And he locates the core of the Trent, and throws Gungnir with all of his might, and we see a colorful trail behind the lance, and it pierces the monster, and goes through it entirely. Clean through and through. We see the core is broken, and the Trent falls over. Saw Jun, tired, falls to the floor. Saw Jun meets back up with Mancho and notices the two of them have gotten pretty close over the last few days. They ask if they can leave now, and Saw Jun says yeah, but as he goes to grab his lance, he is shocked to see the Trent still alive, even with the hole inside of it. And he wonders what kind of joke this is, and he sees a second core. And feels distraught. The Trent lets out a roar, and begins to attack them. Saw Jun begins to stand in front of them with his spear, and the magic saint blocks the attacks with a barrier, and begins to cough up blood. Seo-joon realizes the only choice is to destroy the second core, and tries to find Gungnir, but he can't find it because it's entangled between the branches, and wonders if the Trent is hiding it on purpose. Seo-joon asks the saint if he can use weakening magic again, and he says he'll try his best. Seo-joon says he'll draw its attention again, and we see him run out of the barrier, avoiding all of the attacks from the Trent monster, while getting close to it. He realizes he will die if he is hit once, and realizes that the saint is reaching his limit, and that there's nobody else but him who can do this, and he pours everything into his spear, and begins to cut through the treant's branches. We see the Trent changes focus from the magic barrier, and begins to put its focus on Seo-joon, but he dodges it by jumping into the air. And while he's in the air, he realizes he can't find any other openings, and while he's thinking, he gets caught by a branch. But as the monster begins to attack him, the weakened spell is casted, and takes his chance to cut his foot free, and runs up the treant's branches. He notices that the chains are thinner than before, and notices the opening, and rushes toward the Trent's core. He leaps at it and begins to extend his spear forward to stab it, but is smacked in the side and gets sent flying away. This heavily injures Seo-joon, and he coughs up blood. We see the monster's overwhelming presence approach him, and it begins to attack him, but the magic saint blocks the attack again for him. We hear the saints thinking that he's impressed at Seo-joon's talent, and that in another year from now, everyone in Korea will know who he is, and one day he'll become the hero of mankind, but right now, he's not strong enough. And even if he has to die in his stead, Seo-joon has to live. The saint yells for him to run away, and Seo-joon says he won't do it. And the saint yells, telling him to accept reality, and Seo-joon says, it's the same for him. He could have left them any time he wanted, and even now, he's trying to sacrifice himself. Seo-joon thinks to himself it's true, running is the best option, leaving the saint behind and escaping with Mancho. But for some reason, he doesn't want to run away, and we see him kneeling before Hercules. And he remembers what Hercules said in his first lecture. What do you think strength is? Power doesn't refer to physical force, and the power he's trying to teach them isn't like that. And true power is atonement, and Hercules explains how because of a curse, he killed his own wife and children, and that he did the 12 labors as atonement. 12 impossible tasks, that Hercules is famous for. Each time he completed one, his reputation would increase. But that people mocked him for murdering his family, but he still refused to give up. He lived for others, and some judged him for this, and he lived like this in hopes that one day he would forgive himself, and living like this, he completed the 12 labors, and even saved Olympus during their war with the giants. Hercules says when you're trying to do something, people will tell you it's impossible. However, others' words aren't important. Again and again, they'll mention how impossible it is, saying you can't do it. And you only need one reason why you must succeed. And that alone is all you need to become a hero. The saint tells Seo-joon the monster isn't one he can handle, and while Seo-joon walks, he can't hear anything except Hercules' words. When the world tells you that you can't do it, and your mind tells you you're at your limit, you keep thinking you can't do it, but to keep walking forward. That is true power, a power that uses your soul. Divine power. We see an energy surge from Seo-joon as he walks toward the Trent, and Hercules describes the power as an overwhelming force. We see the monster attack Seo-joon, and he cuts the branches down. Slicing through them again and again, he leaps toward the Trent, and the next thing we see is just a giant shockwave. The magic saint, barely standing, looks up to see Seo-joon in front of a giant hole he put in the monster. But he notices Seo-joon is falling, so he catches him in a barrier and puts him down. Mancho runs over, and asks if he's okay, and the saint says he's okay, he's just exhausted from using a power he wasn't ready for. The saint says that he was scared, and that he fears death, because he wonders what the world will be like after he dies. And how the world isn't as safe as people believe it to be, and he knows the world still needs him. And that his worries made him paranoid, but after seeing Seo-joon, he realizes the next generation of heroes is ready, and he imagines Seo-joon paving the road for the future heroes and says, time sure does fly. Subscribe for more videos like this, leave a like or a comment to help the channel out. Thanks for watching.